Shrapnel from a 20mm Focke-Wulf cannon shell had just turned First Lieutenant Western Callahan's instrument panel into a lethal storm of flying glass and metal. Plunging toward the jagged, ink-black canopy of the Black Forest at 10,000 feet, he tasted engine oil in his own blood. His burning P-51 Mustang was dead. As he bailed out into the freezing German night, Western reached inside his leather flight jacket, his fingers finding cold, heavily modified steel. His squadron had mercilessly mocked this bastardized Frankenstein pistol for months. Yet, as his silk parachute snapped open, that ridiculous, oversized weapon became the only thing standing between a lone American pilot and 35 enraged Wehrmacht soldiers hunting him in the shadows below. The bitter damp of an English winter had a way of seeping into the very marrow of a man's bones. But inside the corrugated metal walls of Nissen Hut 4 at RAF Leiston, the air was thick with the smell of Hoppy's No. 9, gun solvent, stale coffee, and sweat. It was November 1944. The 357th Fighter Group was taking heavy losses in the skies over Germany. But on the ground, the men found bizarre ways to cope with the sheer, unrelenting terror of their reality. For First Lieutenant Western Artie Callahan, a 23-year-old former machinist from Pittsburgh, salvation didn't come from a hip flask or a deck of cards. It came from a workbench in the back corner of the barracks, littered with metal filings, spare springs, and the scattered anatomy of a standard-issue Colt M1911A1 .45 caliber pistol. "You are going to blow your own damn fingers off, Artie," drawled Sergeant Silas Miller, leaning against the doorframe with a half-smoked Lucky Strike dangling from his lower lip. Miller was a crew chief, a man who knew his way around the innards of a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. But even he looked at Western's creation with a mix of disgust and profound confusion. Western didn't look up from the vice grip. He was carefully filing down a piece of hardened steel he had scavenged from the landing gear strut of a wrecked Spitfire. A standard 1911 holds 7 rounds. Silas, 7. If I get shot down over the Ruhr, 7 rounds isn't a defense. It's an insult. So your bright idea is to turn a perfectly good sidearm into a pipe bomb? Chimed in Private First Class Danny O'Rourke, tossing a rag onto Western's bench. O'Rourke had a point. The pistol clamped in the vise no longer looked like the elegant, reliable sidearm designed by John Moses Browning. It looked like a junkyard dog. Western had discarded the standard magazine, instead welding 2 together and expanding the well to create a monstrous, protruding 20-round magazine. But that wasn't the half of it. To manage the muzzle flip of firing 20, 45 ACP rounds in rapid succession, Western had machined a crude, oversized compensator and threaded it onto the barrel. He had replaced the mainspring with a heavy-duty coil ripped from an aircraft's hydraulic system. Most terrifying of all, he had filed down the sear and the disconnector. With a slight shift of his thumb, the weapon wouldn't just fire semi-automatically. It would run away, firing in uncontrollable bursts until the magazine was empty. To keep it from jumping out of his hands, he had fashioned a folding skeletal wire stock out of a radio antenna, which bolted directly onto the mainspring housing. Captain Charles Bradley, the squadron commander, had seen it a week prior. He had picked it up, felt the absurd, unbalanced weight of the thing, and handed it back with a shake of his head. "Callahan, if the Luftwaffe doesn't kill you, that abomination will. They'll bury you with a piece of slide embedded in your forehead." The men called it Callahan's abomination. They mocked him relentlessly in the mess hall. They joked that if he ever pulled the trigger, the recoil would send him flying backward across the English Channel. But Western wasn't deterred. He had spent his childhood taking apart tractor engines and rebuilding them. He understood tolerances, pressure, and the raw mechanics of violence. He had test-fired the weapon in a secluded chalk quarry 3 miles from the base. It was deafening. It spit fire like a miniature dragon. but with the wire stock extended and braced against his shoulder, it was brutally, devastatingly effective. It was a submachine gun you could fit inside a pilot's survival vest. "Laugh all you want, O'Rourke," Western said, finally unbolting the weapon from the vise and racking the slide. The heavy spring made a satisfying, aggressive clack. "When we're up there at 25,000 feet, you trust your Mustang. But if gravity wins, and I end up in the mud with the Krauts, I'm trusting this." He slid the heavy, awkward pistol into a custom leather holster he had riveted to his chest rig. The next morning, the siren wailed. The target was the synthetic oil refineries at Merseburg. It was a maximum effort mission, deep into the heart of the Reich. Western didn't know it as he zipped up his fleece-lined flight jacket, but the time for mockery was over. The abomination was about to be baptized in blood. The sky over Germany was not a serene blue. It was a bruised, violent tapestry of black flak bursts, and the white, looping contrails of dying airplanes. Western's P-51, nicknamed Iron Bastard, vibrated fiercely as he pushed the throttle to the firewall. They were flying at 28,000 feet, providing top cover for a massive box of B-17 flying fortresses. The temperature in the unpressurized cockpit was 30 degrees below zero. Ice crystals formed on Western's oxygen mask, and his breath came in ragged, hyperventilating gasps as he scanned the horizon. "Bandits, 3 o'clock high, coming out of the sun," the crackling voice of Captain Bradley echoed in Western's headset. A swarm of Focke-Wulf Fuhl 190s tore through the bomber formation, like wolves tearing into a flock of sheep. The discipline of the escort disintegrated into a chaotic, swirling dogfight. G-forces crushed Western into his seat as he banked sharply to the right, his vision tunneling as he pulled lead on a gray camouflaged German fighter. He squeezed the trigger on his flight stick. The 6.50 caliber machine guns in his wings roared, vibrating the entire airframe. Tracers lashed out, stitching across the enemy fighter's wing route. The Focke-Wulf violently erupted into a ball of orange flame. "Scratch one," Western yelled, adrenaline surging. But his triumph lasted less than a second. A deafening crack echoed through the cockpit, followed by a violent shudder that nearly tore the control stick from his hands. He had been blindsided. Another Fuhl 190 had slipped onto his 6 o'clock. A 20 millimeters high-explosive shell tore through the right wing of the Iron Bastard, severing the aileron cables. A second shell slammed into the engine cowling. Instantly, the cockpit filled with blinding, choking black smoke. Scalding engine oil sprayed across the canopy glass. Western wrestled with the stick, but the Mustang was dead. The nose pitched down violently, entering a flat spin. The altimeter unwound with terrifying speed. 20,000, 15,000, 10,000 feet. Bail out, bail out. He tore off his oxygen mask and communications wire. He grabbed the emergency canopy release handle and yanked. The slipstream caught the heavy perspex canopy and ripped it away, creating a roaring hurricane inside the cockpit. The G-forces of the spin pinned him against the side of the seat. He fought with every ounce of his strength, unbuckling his harness and practically clawing his way out onto the wing. At 4,000 feet, he tumbled into the freezing void. He counted to 3 and pulled the ripcord. The shock of the parachute opening felt like a sledgehammer to the chest, violently halting his descent. He hung in the straps, gasping for air. The silence of the sky, a stark contrast to the roaring chaos moments before. He looked down. Beneath him was a dense, snow-dusted forest, the fringes of the Black Forest, near the borders of the Rhine. As he drifted lower, he saw a winding dirt road cutting through the pines, and on that road, 3 canvas-covered Opel Blitz trucks were grinding to a halt. Tiny, gray-clad figures poured out of the back, pointing up at the sky. They had seen him. Western crashed through the canopy of the pines, thick branches whipping and tearing at his flight suit. He hit the frozen ground hard, his ankle twisting painfully. The breath knocked entirely from his lungs. The parachute silk draped over the trees above him like a giant, neon white beacon. Panic flared in his chest, but his training took over. He hit the quick release on his harness, abandoning the parachute. He needed to move, and he needed to move now. He dragged himself behind the thick trunk of a rotting oak tree, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. From the road, perhaps a half-mile away, he heard the shouts, the harsh, guttural barks of German orders. Da drüben, ist in den Bäumen. Over there, he's in the trees. Then, the chilling sound of dogs barking, large, aggressive hounds, straining at their leashes. Western knelt in the freezing mud. He was alone. His radio was gone. He had a fractured rib, a sprained ankle, a compass, and a map he couldn't read in the fading light. He unzipped his leather flight jacket. His fingers wrapped around the cold, textured grip of the modified M1911. He drew the weapon. It felt heavy, absurd, and unbalanced, just as Captain Bradley had said. With a sharp flick of his wrist, he deployed the wire stock, locking it into place. He racked the slide, chambering a massive, custom-loaded 45 caliber hollow point. The mockery of Station 153 faded from his memory. As the sound of snapping branches and German voices grew closer, Western Callahan closed his eyes, took a deep breath of freezing air, and prepared to introduce the Wehrmacht to the abomination. The darkness of the German forest was absolute, turning the towering pines into jagged, impenetrable silhouettes. The air temperature plummeted, biting at Western's exposed face and seeping through the shearling of his flight jacket. He limped deeper into the woods, favoring his right leg, moving with a desperate, agonizing slowness. Every snapped twig sounded like a gunshot. Every rustle of dry leaves felt like a spotlight. Behind him, the hunt was organizing. Unteroffizier Klaus Richter, a battle-hardened veteran of the Eastern Front, led the forward tracking element. Richter commanded a platoon of 35 men from a local Fallschirmjäger, paratrooper, reserve unit. They weren't raw recruits. They were seasoned killers who had survived the meat grinder of Stalingrad, sent westward to recuperate. Hunting down a single, terrified American pilot was meant to be sport to a brief exercise before supper. "Spread out," Richter hissed, gesturing to his men. 50 meters apart. Keep the dogs on a short leash. He is wounded. He won't get far. Western heard the baying of the hounds. It was a terrifying, primal sound that sent ice water through his veins. He knew he couldn't outrun dogs, especially not on a bad ankle. He needed to break their line of sight, find a choke point, and eliminate the trackers before the main body of the platoon collapsed on him. He found his arena at the base of a steep, rocky ravine. A narrow game trail wound its way up the side of the incline, flanked by massive granite boulders and thick, thorny underbrush. It was a natural funnel. Western scrambled up the slope, his breath pluming in the freezing air, until he found a crevice between two rocks that offered absolute concealment and a clear line of sight down the trail. He crouched, the frozen rock biting into his knees. He raised the heavy pistol, pressing the crude wire stock firmly into the pocket of his right shoulder. He clicked the fire selector switch, a tiny, filed piece of steel near the hammer from semi-auto, down to his custom burst setting. He waited. The forest grew eerily quiet, save for the wind howling through the upper branches. Then, a flicker of movement. 2 German scouts appeared at the base of the ravine. They moved with lethal grace, their Mauser Kar 9 8K rifles held at the ready. One held the leash of a massive German shepherd, its nose to the ground, pulling hard up the trail. The dog suddenly stopped, the hackles on its back rising. It looked directly up at the rocks where Western was hiding, and let out a vicious snarl. "Da, oben," the handler whispered, pointing a gloved finger. The second scout raised his rifle, aiming at the shadows. Western knew he had less than a second before a 7.92 millimeters round tore through his skull. He didn't aim with the sights. He aimed over the massive compensator, letting instinct and muscle memory take over. He pulled the trigger. What happened next shattered the stillness of the forest with apocalyptic violence. The modified 1911 didn't just fire, it detonated. The filed sear and heavy spring worked in terrifying harmony. In the span of a single heartbeat, the pistol unleashed a 5-round burst of heavy, .45 caliber ordnance. The deafening BRRRAP sounded like an anti-aircraft gun. A massive tongue of orange flame erupted from the compensator, illuminating the ravine in a strobe light of hellfire. The impact was devastating. The custom-loaded, heavy-grain bullets struck the scouts with the force of a freight train. The first soldier was thrown backward off his feet, his chest plate shattered. The second scout barely had time to register the flash before the remaining rounds of the burst tore through the brush, neutralizing him instantly. The dog, terrified by the sheer concussive force and noise, snapped its leash and fled, howling into the darkness. Western released the trigger, the heavy gun smoking in the frigid air. The recoil had pushed him back against the rock, but the heavy spring and the wire stock had kept the muzzle perfectly level. The abomination had worked. It had worked too well. Silence slammed back down on the forest, but it was a heavy, pregnant silence. Down in the valley, Unteroffizier Richter froze. He looked at the men around him. That wasn't the distinct ping of an American M1 Garand, nor was it the rapid, chattering tear of a Thompson submachine gun. The sound was too heavy, too deep, and impossibly fast. It sounded like a heavy machine gun, but no pilot carried a heavy machine gun. "What in God's name was that?" muttered Gefreiter Hoffman, clutching his MP-40 tighter. Richter's eyes narrowed. The sport was over. The American had teeth. "They have a patrol with him," Richter concluded, his mind making the only logical tactical assumption. A pilot cannot carry a weapon of that caliber. He is linked up with an airborne squad. Richter turned to his radio operator. "Call the trucks. Tell them to bring up the MG-42S and the mortars. We are not dealing with a stray pilot. We are dealing with heavily armed infantry." Up in the rocks, Western ejected the partially spent magazine, catching it before it hit the ground. He slid it into his pocket and slammed a fresh, 20-round magazine into the grip. He had 60 rounds total. He had just used 5. He could hear the shouting below, a frantic, disorganized panic, replacing the disciplined tracking of minutes before. He had bought himself time, but he had also kicked a hornet's nest. He had tricked 35 seasoned German soldiers into believing they were fighting a heavily entrenched squad. Western wiped the sweat from his forehead, leaving a streak of grease and dirt across his skin. He looked at the ugly, bulky pistol in his hand. The barrel was hot enough to brand cattle. "All right, you ugly bastard," Western whispered to the gun. "Let's see how many of them we can fool." He pushed himself up from the rocks, abandoning his perfectly good sniper's nest. If they thought he was a squad, he had to move like one. He began a treacherous, flanking climb through the dense brush, moving parallel to the German advance, preparing to turn the Black Forest into a ghost house. The Black Forest became a theater of shadows and echoes. Western moved with agonizing deliberation, his sprained right ankle screaming in protest with every step he took through the knee-deep snowdrifts. He had abandoned the game trail, opting instead for the brutal, unforgiving terrain of the steep ridges. He needed altitude, and he needed angles. Down in the valley, Unteroffizier Klaus Richter was orchestrating a textbook infantry assault against a ghost. "Set up the MG-42 behind that fallen timber," Richter barked, his breath creating thick white plumes in the moonlight. "Obergefreiter Weber, get the mortar tube assembled in the depression. They are up there, waiting for us to funnel through." The metallic clack-clack of the MG-42 being loaded carried clearly up the ridge. Western, perched behind the roots of a massive, overturned spruce, watched the German movements. They were disciplined. They were fanning out in a wide skirmish line, preparing to lay down a base of suppressive fire before advancing. They genuinely believed they were walking into the teeth of an entrenched American patrol. Western looked at his modified M1911. The oversized compensator was still warm to the touch. He had 55 rounds left, 35 angry men with automatic weapons and high explosives were hunting him. Standard evasion doctrine dictated that a downed pilot should hide, stay completely silent, and wait for the enemy to pass. But Western knew that if he let them form up and sweep the forest systematically, his single, bloody footprint in the snow would eventually give him away. He couldn't hide. He had to keep them terrified. He had to keep them shooting at shadows. He took aim at the mortar team. They were roughly 60 yards away, a nearly impossible shot for a standard sidearm, especially in the dark. But the abomination wasn't standard. Western nestled the wire stock tight against his collarbone, exhaled a long, shaky breath, and clicked the selector switch back to burst. He squeezed the trigger. Brr. App. 3 heavy, 2-3, 0 grain. 45 ACP rounds tore out of the muzzle in a fraction of a second. The oversized compensator vented the burning gases upward, pushing the barrel down and keeping the weapon terrifyingly stable. The recoil punched his shoulder, but the bullets flew true. The round slammed into the mortar team's position. One round shattered the cast-iron baseplate of the mortar with a loud, ringing crang, sending lethal shrapnel flying. Obergefreiter Weber screamed, grabbing his thigh as he collapsed into the snow. Contact. Right flank. Richter roared, dropping to his stomach. Open fire! The forest erupted. The MG-42, infamously known as Hitler's buzzsaw, tore the night apart with its staggering rate of fire. Tracers lashed into the tree line, exactly where Western had been a second before, chewing through thick pine trunks as if they were made of paper. The deafening roar of the machine gun was joined by the sharp, rhythmic cracks of Kar-9 8K rifles. But Western wasn't there. The moment he fired, he had scrambled backward, crab-walking through the snow, ignoring the blinding pain in his ribs. He moved 40 yards laterally, desperately gasping for air, the cold burning his lungs. He found a new vantage point behind a granite outcropping. Below him, the Germans were pouring thousands of rounds into the empty forest. They were wasting ammunition, blinding themselves with their own muzzle flashes, and destroying their night vision. Western smiled grimly, blood from a cut on his forehead mixing with the sweat freezing on his cheek. He racked the slide of the 1911, making sure the next round was seated properly. He aimed down at the extreme left edge of the German skirmish line, targeting 2 soldiers who were advancing cautiously with MP-40 submachine guns. Brr. App. Another 3-round burst. The heavy bullets ripped through the underbrush. One struck the dirt right at the feet of the closest soldier, spraying frozen mud and rock into his face. The man cried out, blindly firing his MP-40 into the canopy in a panic. "They are flanking us!" Gefreiter Hoffman yelled, his voice cracking with panic. "They are on the left now. It's an ambush. Hold your fire. Hold your damn fire," Richter screamed, realizing his men were shooting at nothing. The MG-42 finally sputtered to a halt, the barrel smoking heavily. The silence that followed was heavy and terrifying. The Germans lay in the snow, their weapons trained on the dark tree line, their hearts pounding. They had taken casualties. Their mortar was disabled, and they hadn't even seen the enemy. The psychological toll was immense. They were veterans of the Russian winter. But this felt different. The invisible American squad possessed a weapon that sounded like an anti-aircraft cannon and moved like a ghost. Western sat with his back against the granite, his hands shaking from adrenaline and cold. He popped the 20-round magazine out. It felt light. He had fired 11 rounds total. He swapped it for his second, fully loaded magazine, placing the partially empty one carefully in his breast pocket. He was keeping them at bay, but he couldn't play this game forever. The pain in his ankle was throbbing with a sickening rhythm, and the cold was sapping his strength. He pulled out his compass, shielding the glow-in-the-dark dial with his hand. Due west. The Rhine was due west. If he could put the river between him and the Fallschirmjäger, he might just live to see the dawn. For 2 agonizing hours, Western dragged himself through the dense, snow-covered pines. He utilized the abomination sparingly, firing short, aggressive bursts whenever the German tracking dogs got too close, instantly killing the momentum of his pursuers. He was a phantom, a lone bleeding machinist from Pittsburgh, single-handedly holding off a platoon of Germany's elite. But the phantom was running out of steam. The sound of rushing water cut through the silence of the forest. Western crested a small, treacherous ridge and looked down. Below him was a deep, violently churning gorge. The water was black and fast, filled with jagged ice flows. Spanning the gorge was an old, moss-covered stone logging bridge, barely wide enough for a horse-drawn cart. Beyond the bridge, the terrain flattened out a direct path toward the French border. It was his only way across. Western slid down the embankment, his boots slipping on the frozen mud. He reached the edge of the bridge and paused, panting heavily. His vision was swimming. Blood loss and hypothermia were setting in. He leaned heavily against the cold stone of the bridge's archway, gripping the M1911 so tightly his knuckles were white. Suddenly, a flare shot into the sky from the ridge behind him, bathing the gorge in a harsh, swaying magnesium glare. Unteroffizier Richter stepped out of the tree line, less than 100 yards away. He was not accompanied by a skirmish line this time. He held a piece of torn, blood-soaked shearling leather in his fist, a piece of Western's flight jacket, snagged on a thorn bush. Richter looked at the leather, then looked down at the single set of bloody boot prints, leading straight to the bridge. The horrific realization washed over the veteran German's face. The terrifying squad, the heavy automatic weapons, the flanking maneuvers, it was all a lie. Ein Mann, Richter whispered. One man. Humiliation turned into a blinding, murderous rage. He dropped the leather and raised his MP-40. It is only one man, he roared to his platoon, his voice echoing off the stone walls of the gorge. No more hiding. Rush the bridge. Kill him. The shadows of the forest erupted. Over 24 German soldiers poured out of the tree line, abandoning all tactical cover. They were furious. They had been made fools of by a single, crippled pilot. They charged down the slope toward the bridge, screaming, firing their weapons from the hip. Bullets struck the stone archway around Western, showering him in sharp chips of rock. A round grazed his left shoulder, tearing through his jacket and drawing a fresh line of fire across his skin. He was trapped. There was no more flanking. There was no more hiding. There was only the bridge, the freezing river below, and the charging enemy. Western stepped out from behind the stone archway, planting his good foot firmly on the wooden planks of the bridge. He raised the abomination. He didn't bother with the burst fire selector. He pushed the tiny piece of filed steel all the way forward. Full runaway auto. He locked the wire stock into his shoulder, gritted his teeth, and pulled the trigger. The modified M1911 unleashed hell. The heavy-duty hydraulic spring Western had salvaged at Station 153, worked with brutal, mechanical perfection. The gun fired at a cyclic rate of over 800 rounds per minute. A continuous, blinding tongue of fire, 3 feet long, erupted from the compensator. The noise in the enclosed gorge was cataclysmic, a solid, unbroken wall of sound that physically battered the eardrums. The 20-round magazine emptied in less than 2 seconds. The concentrated hail of heavy, .45 caliber hollow points hit the leading edge of the German charge. Like a scythe, the massive bullets, designed to stop a man dead in his tracks, tore through the charging soldiers with horrifying kinetic energy. 4 men in the front fell instantly, their bodies violently thrown backward into the snow. The psychological shock of the sheer volume of fire from a single man on a narrow bridge broke the momentum of the assault. Western's hands were numb from the violent vibration. The slide locked back. The barrel was glowing, a dull, angry cherry red in the dark. He hit the magazine release. The empty magazine dropped to the planks. Before it even registered, he slammed his third and final 20-round magazine into the well and dropped the slide. The Germans had hit the dirt, scrambling behind whatever rocks and logs they could find. They were laying down a heavy volume of suppressing fire, but the narrow choke point of the bridge meant they couldn't bring their numbers to bear. Mortar. Bring up the mortar. Richter screamed from behind a thick oak tree, firing a burst from his MP40 that whistled inches past Western's ear. Western knew if they got a mortar tube leveled at the bridge, he was dead. He couldn't retreat, and he couldn't advance. He had to keep them pinned down. He fired again, this time sweeping the gun back and forth, spraying the opposite bank. The weapon was overheating dangerously. The custom recoil spring was smoking, burning the grease right off the metal. The heat radiating through the grip was searing his hand through his leather flight gloves. But he couldn't let go. Clack, 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 clack. He fired in short, controlled bursts now, manually feathering the trigger, aiming at muzzle flashes. Every time a German soldier tried to peek out from cover, Western punished them with a heavy .45 round that shattered rock and splintered wood. He was putting down the suppressing fire of a heavy machine gun with a weapon that fit in a holster. The men back at Nissen Hut 4 had laughed at him. They had called it a pipe bomb. But as Western stood alone on that bridge, bleeding, freezing, and holding off a platoon of seasoned killers, the abomination was the most beautiful, reliable piece of machinery he had ever built. But then, disaster struck. As Western squeezed the trigger to suppress another push by Gefreiter Hoffmann, the gun made a sickening crunch. The slide seized halfway back, jamming violently. A piece of the fractured, overheated brass casing had ruptured inside the chamber, locking the action solid. Western yanked the slide. It wouldn't budge. He hit it against the stone wall. Nothing. Across the gorge, Richter heard the distinct, hollow sound of a malfunction. He saw the American pilot desperately hitting his weapon. The wall of fire had ceased. Richter stood up, a cruel smile spreading across his face. He pointed his MP40 at the bridge. "He is jammed! Advance! Advance and finish him!" The Germans rose from the snow like angry wolves, their eyes fixed on the lone figure on the bridge. Western Callahan was out of time, out of luck, and holding a dead piece of burning metal. The metallic clack of the jammed slide echoed in Western's ears like a death knell. Through the drifting cordite smoke, the silhouettes of Unteroffizier Klaus Richter and the surviving Fallschirmjäger materialized from the tree line. They were no longer moving with tactical precision. They were a mob, driven by the furious realization that they had been butchered by a single, wounded airman. Ist unbewaffnet. Get him! Richter's voice tore through the freezing air. Western's thumb frantically tore at the slide serrations, tearing his gloves and slicing his skin on the sharp, overheated steel. The ruptured brass casing was welded to the chamber wall by friction and heat. The weapon was a 4-pound paperweight, 30 yards, 20 yards. Gefreiter Hoffmann was at the head of the pack, his MP40 raised, screaming a guttural war cry. Western had no cover, no backup, and no working firearm. But he still had the heavy, steel frame of the abomination. He didn't drop the weapon. Instead, he collapsed the wire stock, gripping the searing hot barrel with his heavily calloused, gloved left hand. He wielded the jammed M1911 by the barrel like a medieval bludgeon. Hoffmann reached the stone archway of the bridge, his finger tightening on the trigger of his submachine gun. Western didn't wait to be executed. Ignoring the agonizing, tearing pain in his sprained ankle, he lunged forward. Before Hoffmann could depress the trigger, Western swung the heavy steel grip of the pistol in a brutal, sweeping arc. The solid steel mainspring housing, reinforced for the custom recoil spring, collided with Hoffmann's jaw with a sickening, wet crack. The German soldier's eyes rolled back instantly, his MP40 firing a wild burst into the night sky as he crumpled to the wooden planks. But there were a dozen more right behind him. 2 Car-9 8K rifles barked in unison. A 7.92 millimeters round tore through the fleshy part of Western's left thigh, spinning him violently toward the edge of the bridge. The pain was absolute, a blinding white flare that momentarily robbed him of his vision. He fell against the low stone parapet. Below him, the gorge roared, the black, churning water of the river, filled with jagged spears of river ice. Richter stepped onto the bridge, his face a mask of cold fury. He kicked Hoffman's unconscious body aside and leveled his MP-40 at Western's chest. End of the line. American. Western looked at the German, then looked down at the abyss. He grinned, his teeth stained pink with his own blood. Not yet. He threw himself backward over the parapet. The wind shrieked past his ears for one terrifying second before he hit the water. The impact was like striking solid concrete. The freezing temperature of the river drove the air from his lungs instantly. A shock so profound, it nearly stopped his heart. The current grabbed him with the strength of a titan, pulling him under the churning, freezing surface. Above him, he could faintly hear the dull, muffled chatter of Richter's MP-40 firing blindly into the water, the bullets slicing through the current inches from his head. Western tumbled uncontrollably, smashed against submerged boulders, his heavy leather flight jacket soaking up water and dragging him down like an anchor. He kept his right hand clamped in a death grip around the abomination. It was a stupid, irrational instinct, but the gun was a piece of him now. He didn't know which way was up. His lungs screamed for oxygen. His injured leg was entirely numb. Just as the black edges of unconsciousness began to close in, his knee slammed into a gravel shoal. He thrashed wildly, breaking the surface, gasping violently as the freezing night air hit his face. He was roughly 400 yards downstream from the bridge, having been swept around a sharp bend in the gorge. The water was shallower here, eddying against a steep mud bank, tangled with the exposed roots of a massive weeping willow. Western dragged himself out of the current. He was trembling so violently, his teeth clicked together like castanets. Hypothermia was no longer a threat. It was a reality. His wet clothing was already beginning to freeze in the sub-zero wind. He collapsed into the mud beneath the overhang of the willow roots, shielded from the moonlight. He lay there for 10 minutes, waiting for his heart to explode or for the darkness to finally take him. But the stubborn, mechanical brain of the Pittsburgh machinist refused to quit. He sat up, his fingers completely devoid of feeling. He pulled the jammed 1911 from his lap. In the pitch black, working entirely by touch and muscle memory, Western Callahan began to field strip the weapon. He pushed out the slide stop lever, separating the slide from the frame. The barrel was still jammed tight. He needed a tool to punch out the ruptured brass. He patted down his frozen flight suit and found his standard-issue survival knife. Using the thick pommel of the knife, he hammered brutally against the back of the barrel link. Clack, clack, crack. The barrel broke free from the slide. Now, for the casing. He pulled the heavy firing pin out of the rear of the slide. It was made of hardened steel. He inserted the sharp end of the firing pin down the front of the barrel and slammed the base of the barrel against a flat rock. The ruptured brass casing popped out of the chamber, landing in the mud with a dull thud. Western let out a ragged, freezing gasp of triumph. He reassembled the pistol in the dark, the metallic clicks of the reassembly sounding impossibly loud over the rushing water. He racked the slide. It was smooth. The abomination was alive again. He reached into his breast pocket. He had one magazine left, the partially spent one from the ravine. He didn't know how many rounds were in it. Maybe 8, maybe 10. He slammed it home. From the woods above the embankment, a twig snapped. The low, guttural murmur of German voices drifted down through the freezing air. Richter hadn't given up. He had split his men, walking the banks, determined to find the American's body. Western leaned his back against the frozen mud wall, leveling the pistol over his knees. He wiped a mixture of river water and blood from his eyes. He had nowhere left to run. This was the final stand. The pale, bruised light of pre-dawn began to bleed over the jagged horizon, painting the black forest in desolate, freezing shades of gray. The wind had died down, leaving behind a silence so absolute it felt heavy. Unteroffizier Klaus Richter stood at the edge of the tree line, his breath frosting in the still air. His uniform was torn, his face smeared with soot and the blood of his own men. Behind him stood the shattered remnants of his platoon. Only 5 men remained combat effective. Gefreiter Brandt leaned heavily on his Kar-9 8K rifle, his face pale with shock. Schütze, Steiner, and Vogel stared into the trees with the hollow, haunted eyes of men who had just walked through a meat grinder. Richter's career, his honor, and his sanity demanded the American's head. He could not return to his commanding officer and report that 30 veteran Fallschirmjäger had been systematically dismantled by a single, downed pilot. It was tactically impossible. It was humiliating. Herr Unteroffizier, Brandt whispered, his voice trembling. He pointed a gloved finger down the steep, treacherous embankment toward the river. Richter followed the gesture. The water of the river was black and sluggish, choked with jagged flows of ice. But there, leading directly out of the shallows and vanishing under the massive, tangled overhang of a weeping willow's root system, was a thick, unmistakable trail of dark crimson staining the fresh, white snow. Richter nodded slowly, a cold, predatory calm washing over him. The ghost was finally cornered. The American was bleeding out, trapped against the freezing water with his back to a wall of mud. He unslung an M24 steel hand granate, a stick grenade from his belt. He wasn't going to take any more chances with a direct assault. He wasn't going to send his men into the teeth of whatever ungodly automatic weapon the pilot was holding. He would simply drop the high explosive into the root cavern and blow the entire overhang into the river. Spread out, Richter signaled with sharp, silent hand gestures. Cover the roots. If he crawls out, empty your magazines into him. Do not stop firing until the water runs red. Beneath the earth, the phantom was fading. Down in the suffocating darkness of the mud cavern, First Lieutenant Western Callahan was losing the war against his own body. Hypothermia had moved past the violent shivering stage. His limbs felt heavy, distant, and wrapped in thick wool. His breathing was dangerously shallow, each inhalation tasting of copper and frozen rot. He couldn't feel his left leg at all, where the 7.92mm round had torn through his thigh, but his right hand clamped around the freezing, scarred steel grip of the modified M1911 was anchored by pure, stubborn adrenaline. The mechanical brain of the Pittsburgh machinist refused to quit, even as his biological systems began to shut down. Western rested the heavy, oversized compensator of the weapon on his upraised knee to keep it steady. He had field stripped and cleared the jammed weapon in the pitch black, working entirely by muscle memory. Now, he had one partially spent 20-round magazine left in the well. He had no idea how many heavy, 45 caliber hollow points remained. 8, 10, it didn't matter. It was all he had left to negotiate his survival. He heard the crunch of boots on the snow above him. The sound was muffled by the thick layer of frozen mud and roots, but it was deliberate. They were directly over his head. Western tilted his head back, staring up at the dense lattice of thick, wooden roots that formed the ceiling of his makeshift bunker. He thumbed the tiny custom-filed selector switch back to the burst setting. If he held the trigger down on full auto, he would empty his last rounds in less than a second. He needed controlled, devastating violence. Directly above him, Richter unscrewed the metal cap at the bottom of the stick grenade's wooden handle. A tiny porcelain bead attached to a pull cord fell into his palm. Clink. The sound was microscopic, but in the dead silence of the riverbank, it echoed in Western's ears like a church bell. He knew exactly what that sound was. Infantry training at Fort Benning had drilled it into his skull. They were prepping a grenade. If Richter dropped a live explosive down into the roots, Western had nowhere to dive. The concussion in the enclosed space would turn his internal organs to liquid. He couldn't just shoot upward blindly. If he killed Richter, the live grenade would simply drop from the dead German's hand and roll right into Western's lap. He had to change the environment. He had to destroy the floor beneath Richter's feet. Western ignored the encroaching darkness in his vision. He analyzed the thickest, load-bearing root directly above him, a piece of wood the size of a man's thigh, holding up a massive chunk of the frozen, overhanging bank. He raised the heavy pistol, bracing the wire stock against his collarbone. He aimed an inch below the thickest part of the root. As Richter's fingers tightened around the porcelain bead, preparing to yank the friction fuse, Western squeezed the trigger. The abomination roared. Brr, ap, ap. In the tight confines of the mud cavern, the concussive blast of the heavy .45 ACP burst was physically staggering. The massive muzzle flash illuminated the dark hole in a blinding, strobe light wash of orange hellfire. The heavy 2.30 grain bullets didn't hit flesh. They slammed into the frozen mud and timber of the root system with the force of a sledgehammer. The thick, load-bearing root shattered under the localized, high-kinetic impact, splintering violently. The structural integrity of the overhang instantly failed. Above, Richter felt the ground vanish beneath his boots. With a shout of pure terror, the German Unteroffizier plummeted downward as a 2-ton chunk of frozen mud, snow, and timber collapsed into the cavern. Richter hit the shallow water and mud hard. The wind knocked completely out of his lungs. The stick grenade flew from his grasp. The pull cord untugged, landing harmlessly in the freezing current and sinking to the bottom. Total chaos erupted on the riverbank. Steiner, Brandt, and Vogel panicked, seeing the ground swallow their commander, and hearing the terrifying, rapid-fire roar of the phantom weapon again. They abandoned all discipline. They rushed to the ragged edge of the collapsed bank, pointing their MP-40 submachine guns downward and firing blindly into the cloud of descending dirt and snow. Debris and hot brass rained down on Western. He was half buried in the fresh collapse, freezing water soaking his chest. But through the dust and the early morning light, he saw the silhouettes of the German soldiers standing on the precarious lip of the ruined bank above him. He didn't hesitate. He swung the heavy, smoking barrel of the 1911 upward. Brr, ap. The heavy hydraulic spring cycled with brutal perfection. 3 rounds tore upward through the gray light. Schütze Steiner took a round directly to the center mass, the immense stopping power of the custom bullet throwing him violently backward into the snow. Brr, ap. Another burst. Vogel's knee shattered, and he tumbled forward, screaming, rolling down the collapsed dirt ramp and splashing heavily into the river beside the stunned Richter. Brandt, the last man standing, screamed in panic, fumbling to rack the bolt of his car, 98K. Western tracked him, his hands completely numb, his vision narrowing to a pinprick. He pulled the trigger for the final time. BRRRAPP. Click. The last remaining rounds found their mark, neutralizing the final threat on the ridge. The heavy steel slide of the modified M1911 locked back on an empty chamber with a hollow, metallic ring. The barrel was smoking heavily, the grease burning off the metal in the frigid air. Western dropped the empty weapon into his lap. His head fell back against the freezing mud. He had fired his last bullet. He was completely spent. The adrenaline that had kept his heart beating finally evaporated, leaving behind a crushing, unbearable wave of exhaustion. He closed his eyes, listening to the rushing water, waiting for the cold to finally pull him under. But the end did not sound like silence. It started as a low, rhythmic vibration trembling through the frozen mud against Western's back. It wasn't the erratic crunch of infantry boots. It was a heavy, mechanical, relentless grind. Suddenly, a massive roar drowned out the sound of the river. Through the thin line of pine trees on the opposite bank, a massive shape violently shoved its way through the brush. The olive-drab steel hull of an American M4 Sherman tank crushed a small birch tree beneath its treads, its massive 75mm main gun tracking deliberately toward the ruined bridge upriver. Painted on the side of the turret, in stark white letters, was the name Iron Resolve. Behind the armored behemoth, a squad of heavily armed infantrymen from the U.S. 3rd Infantry Division fanned out in a wide skirmish line, their M1 Garand's and Thompson's submachine guns raised, their eyes scanning the tree line. The massive, hours-long firefight in the gorge had drawn the attention of the advancing Allied armored column. "Movement! Down on the far bank!" shouted Sergeant David Hayes, a grizzled infantryman from Ohio, pointing toward the collapsed willow tree. Western tried to open his eyes. He tried to raise his arm, to wave, to shout that he was friendly, but his vocal cords refused to work. He could only manage a weak, trembling twitch of his fingers. He watched through half-open eyes as Hayes and a young medic named Corporal Jimmy Collins scrambled down the opposite bank, hitting the freezing water and wading frantically across the shallows toward the collapsed overhang. They found Western half buried in the mud and ice, a gruesome, horrifying sight of torn shearling leather, frostbite, and blood. "Jesus Christ, Doc, we got an airman," Hayes yelled over his shoulder, immediately dropping his rifle and pulling debris off Western's chest. "He's alive, but barely. Get the plasma." Collins splashed down beside them, instantly tearing open his medical kit. As the young corporal worked frantically to cut away Western's flight suit and slap a tourniquet onto his shattered thigh, his eyes fell upon the heavy, blackened piece of metal resting in the pilot's lap. The gun was a horrifying mess. The slide was deeply scarred and locked open. The massive, oversized compensator was caked in black carbon and mud. The custom wire stock was bent at an awkward angle. It looked like a piece of industrial scrap metal, salvaged from a factory explosion. Collins paused for a split second, picking up the modified 1911 with a blood-stained glove. He weighed it in his hand, his brow furrowing as he took in the extended, welded magazine well and the heavy hydraulic mainspring. "What the hell kind of weapon is this, Lieutenant?" Collins muttered, genuine bewilderment cutting through the urgency of the moment. Western Callahan forced his eyes open. He looked up at the young medic, then at the smoking, battered piece of steel that had kept him breathing through the longest night of his life. A weak, blood-stained smile broke across his cracked, freezing lips. "It's an abomination, son," Western whispered hoarsely, his voice barely audible over the rumble of the Sherman tank. "And it works just fine." 6 weeks later, inside Nissen Hut 4, at RAF Leiston, the drafting table in the corner sat empty. Sergeant Silas Miller and Private First Class Danny O'Rourke stared at the object resting on a velvet cloth in the center of the room. It was the modified M1911. American infantry had recovered it from the riverbank after Western was evacuated. The steel was pitted, the barrel warped from immense heat, and the custom wire stock permanently bent. It looked entirely ruined. Yet, nobody in the 357th Fighter Group was laughing anymore. The after-action report from the 3rd Infantry Division detailed the grim discovery of 35 elite Fallschirmjäger casualties scattered across a ravine, a stone bridge, and a riverbank. They had been decimated by what German prisoners swore was a heavily armed, Phantom automatic weapons squad. Western Callahan, recovering in a London hospital with a silver star pinned to his chest, had single-handedly broken their assault with a weapon forged from scavenged scrap and sheer defiance. The mockery was gone, replaced by a profound, hushed reverence for the bruised, ugly machine that had dragged a man out of hell